The Incas by Nigel Davies. Chapter 4, The Last Conquerors. This chapter is concerned with the process of long-range conquest attributed to Tupac Inca and his successor, Wanaka. The valuable evidence will be presented as to the extent of their domains and the order in which they were occupied. Such matters as the administration and impressive infrastructure of these conquered provinces will be discussed in subsequent chapters. The most coherent sources of information on Inca conquest subsequent to those made by Pachacutec are Cieza, Sarmiento, and Cabello, together with the much later version of Cobo. Contemporary archaeological research offers important data as to the final extent of Inca domination. The conquests assigned by two of these leading sources to a co-reign of Pachacutec and Tupac probably were in fact made by the latter at a time when Pachacutec was either dead or too old to be much involved. Pachacutec's own long-range expeditions were likely confined to Callao and the highland regions of central Peru. Tupac Inca, though never attaining the status of his father as a founder and creator, both human and divine, was nonetheless an accomplished leader. In Inca tradition, his fame was legendary. His range of conquest stretched for nearly 2,000 miles, from North Ecuador to central Chile. Hence, his achievement bears comparison with that of Alexander the Great, whose farthest penetration into India, reached with the decisive aid of horses, brought him to a distance of some 2,500 miles as the crow flies from his home base in Macedon. In considering the course of these expeditions, one must constantly be borne in mind. The importance of the Mitame system as a means of consolidation cannot be exaggerated. Without it, the expansion of the empire would have served little purpose. Tables 1 and 2 offer a summary of the main events in the military careers of Tupac and Huayna Capac, as given by the four chroniclers mentioned above. What they offer is a far from complete record of what occurred, but rather a kind of resume of such data as survived decades after the empire collapsed. The earliest account, that of Cieza, was written in about 1553. The last, Cobo, is dated exactly a century later. At this point, we are concerned simply with what each source relates on the sequence of conquest. The absorption of specific regions, such as Chile, Ecuador, and Timor, will subsequently be considered. Finally, some consideration as to how the chroniclers might have obtained their information becomes essential in order to assess the validity of these documents. For the reigns of Tupac and his successor, the link between Sarmiento's account, 1572, and that of Cabello, 1586, is even closer than for earlier events. Of the two, Cabello generally offers more names of people and places, particularly in Ecuador, but Sarmiento provides material not included in the Cabello version. The information of the two chroniclers on both reigns can be compared with that of Cieza and Cobo in tables 1 and 2. Certain episodes are described in much more detail in Appendix A, which omits the Cieza and Cobo versions of events. Appendix A simply serves to demonstrate beyond any doubt that a large proportion of the historical data provided by the most informative historical sources, Sarmiento and Cabello, derive from some common source. Table 1 summarizes the main events reported for the reign of Tupac, including the period when, according to two versions, an aging Pachacutec still survived as co-ruler. Because the table gives page references for each event, these are not included in the text that follows. In this table, certain series of place names that appear to belong to a single campaign have been somewhat arbitrarily bracketed together and labeled A through E. As can be seen from the table, such campaigns do not necessarily follow each other in the same order in each version. For the interlinked accounts of Sarmiento and Cabello, the order is almost the same. For the other two chroniclers, the sequence differs more widely. At this stage, a short examination of the four sources may help clarify their similarities and their differences. Taking first the Sarmiento and Cabello versions, the campaign designated A1 starts in Cusco and takes the road to Chinchasuyu, leading to the province of the Quechuas. As may be noted in Table 1, the principal places mentioned largely concur. From the comparative list of these two versions, given in Appendix A, it can be seen, for instance, that in each of the provinces of the Quechuas and in the province of Angarais, 3 identically named forts are occupied, together with the capture of one chief called Chuquisguaman. The chroniclers then report an initial assault on the kingdom of Timor, the Pacasmayo River or Pacasmayo Valley being mentioned in each instance. In both accounts, Campaign A1 involves the subjection of Tumebamba and ends in Quito. The role of Quito in the conquests of Tupac, as we shall later see, is probably much exaggerated by the two chroniclers. Both then report that Tupac, without returning to Cusco, descended to the Ecuadorian coastal province of Huancavilcas, Campaign A2, and proceeding via Tumbes, undertook a conquest of Timor. Cabello, but not Sarmiento, states that its ruler was sent to Cusco. He also includes a long and valuable account of the dynasty of Lambayeque, Timor's neighbor. According to the same two chroniclers, Campaign B was directed against a region lying east and southeast of Cusco that formed part of Antisuyu and on whose mountain slopes lived many primitive peoples. Both accounts note that the Inca army encountered 4 nations or provinces. The names of these are given in Appendix A: the Opataris, Manosuyos, Chunchos, and Chiponawas, who were subsequently attacked, apparently coincide, and both sources identify the same chieftains as being captured. Though victories are reported, the campaign apparently achieved little, and in the hot and damp climate to which they were unaccustomed, the Inca suffered heavy losses. The campaign designated C is described most succinctly by Cabello and Sarmiento in spite of its vast extent. It starts in Colao, where both mention the taking of the same 4 forts, see Appendix A, and the capture of the same 2 leaders, who are skinned and made into drums. The campaign ends in Chile, preceded in Sarmiento's version by Charcas. Both accounts mention the taking of Coquimbo in Chile. Sarmiento names the Chilean chieftain Michimalongo and describes the Rio Mal as the southernmost limit of the campaign. Campaign D in Sarmiento consists of a briefly mentioned expedition against Chachapoyas, northeast of Cajamarca. The two sources then make passing reference to operations in the coast region of Condisuyu and note a visit to many provinces. Cabello concurs that Tupac marched in a northwesterly direction as far as Chaucha, finally reaching Cajamarca and Chachapoyas. He adds that captains were sent from Cusco to the coast, where the Chinchas resisted, but others, such as the Nazca and Ica, yielded peacefully. Finally, both texts tell of a visit to Yanacayo, where a group of rebels were ceremoniously pardoned, followed by the death of Tupac. The much earlier report of Cieza de Leon is informative but somewhat more brief. Many names differ from those mentioned above. The account begins with an expedition to Callao after Pachacutec handed over power to Tupac. This incident might be identified with Sarmiento's mention of a campaign carried out in Colasuyu by Pachacutec just before he named Tupac heir and co-ruler. Cieza reports Chucuito in Chile as the site of Tupac's last campaign. He then states that Tupac sent messengers to Condisuyu and to the Andes, i.e. Antisuyu. Various sources describe the sending of messengers as a standard preliminary to the dispatch of a military expedition. Hence, this mention of messengers may legitimately be taken as Cieza's sole reference to Sarmiento and Cabello's campaign. B. Cabello also makes an oblique reference to Condisuyu in this context. Cieza next mentions an expedition that proceeded via Bonbon and Chaucha to the province of Huaylas, also named by Sarmiento and Cabello. The latter's campaign A1 is thus, in effect, reported by Cieza, who merely alters the sequence and adds to the list of objectives Bracamoros, Ayahuasca near the present-day border between Peru and Ecuador, and Lacatunga in Ecuador. Exactly as in Sarmiento and Cabello's campaign A2, Cieza reports an advance to the coast starting from Quito, without mention of any prior return to Cusco. After Tumbes was taken, Timor was duly defeated, though again, only after the very briefest description is given of this momentous event. Tupac then returned to Cusco before mounting a new expedition to the coastal region south of Pachacamac, corresponding in part to Campaign D, where Nazcas and Chinchas both yielded without a struggle. Against Huarco, a bitter war was fought that lasted 3 years. Huarco is also mentioned by Cabello. Finally, Cieza reports an expedition against Colasuyu in Chile that would appear to relate to Sarmiento and Cabello's campaign C because of the mention of Charcas and the Rio Male in Chile. Cobo's account of Tupac's conquest bears a very distinct resemblance to those of Sarmiento and Cabello, but the order of events is rather different. Antisuyu, campaign B, comes first, with specific mention of the same peoples, Chunchos and Mojos. Part of the Colasuyu campaign C comes next and includes the same story of the two Cola chiefs made into drums, followed by an abbreviated version of the Chinchasuyu expedition A1 with a much shorter list of place names on the route. Cobo thereafter reports a second installment of the Colasuyu campaign ending in Chile. He mentions Coquimbo and Charcas, as does Sarmiento, but adds Tiwanaku and Tucumán omitted from the earlier lists. The story continues with Yanacayo, campaign E in other versions, and ends with a journey to Quito and down to Tumbes, reflecting for a second time campaigns A1 and A2 of Sarmiento and Cabello. To these accounts may be added that of Garcilasco, who tells a somewhat different tale. His story is diffuse and confused, to the point that it becomes hard to compare it with other sources. His version of Tupac's reign mentions approximately the same conquests as the others. A campaign against Chachapoyas is described, followed by a descent upon Huacabamba and Ayavaca. Numerous place names are included, and Tupac finally reaches Quito, descends to the sea, and conquers Timor. Betanzos gives an interesting account of Tupac's construction of Sacsayhuaman, as well as a fort in the Yucca Valley, or the Yucay Valley rather, but he offers relatively few place names that relate to campaigns. Indeed, it is hardly feasible to make of such names another column in tables 1 and 2. Betanzos mentions 2 campaigns against Antisuyu, but offers data on local modes of dress and methods of cultivation rather than on people or places. Nonetheless, in writing of an expedition to Callao, he does name 3 of the 4 forts Sarmiento described as captured: Asilo, Arapa, and Pucarane, Sick. In short, Tupac is credited with the conquest of most of what we know as the Inca Empire. In the north, he penetrated far into Ecuador. In the south, he went beyond Callao and subdued large areas of Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile. It may be worth noting that Juan Poma attributes the conquest of Chile to a relative identified as Apu Capac, as well as other distinguished leaders. Huayna Capac. In discussing the conquest of Huayna Capac, Tupac's successor, the fullest accounts are again those of Sarmiento and Cabello, and again they follow each other so closely that they can conveniently be taken together. They differ in a few respects, as can be seen in some detail in Appendix A. In general terms, Cabello names many more places and people than Sarmiento does in describing the Ecuadorian campaigns. For Huayna Capac's military expeditions, the story can in effect be reduced to 2 sections, designated in Table 1 as Parts A and B. Part C is a mere prolongation of Part B. According to both Sarmiento and Cabello, the Inca, after a lightning excursion northward to defeat the rebellious Chachapoyas beyond Cajamarca, returned to Cusco and then headed southward. As described by Cabello, after passing through Callao, Huayna Capac fought hard battles against the savage Mojos and Chirihuanos on the eastern frontier of the empire. Sarmiento makes a passing reference to Antisuyu. According to both chroniclers, Huayna Capac then proceeded to Cochabamba, where he settled many Minimes, then went on to Pocona, and returned to Cusco after a pilgrimage to the shrine of Copacabana on Lake Titicaca. Sarmiento, but not Cabello, interposes a campaign in Chile between the battle with the Chiriguanos and the visit to Cochabamba. Certain details listed in Appendix A, such as the building of the palace of Casana by Sinchi Roca, who was appointed governor of Cusco in the ruler's absence, and the reconstruction of the frontier fortress of Pocona, built by the Inca's father, demonstrate the continued interconnection between the 2 accounts. The link is established even more precisely by the comments the 2 sources give on the Urus. According to both versions, Huayna Capac instructed them as to how they should live and in what parts of the lake they should fish. Cabello's statement, having given to the Uru Indians orders as to how they should live in that lagoon and defining the boundaries of the area where they should fish, compares with that of Sarmiento. Gave orders as to how the Uru should live and gave them their boundary, defining the part in which each of their villages should fish in the lagoon. The remainder of Huayna Capac's wars are described in very similar terms in the 2 accounts, as can clearly be seen in Table 2. Specific aspects of the prolonged struggle against the tribes of Ecuador will be considered later. In effect, the rest of Huayna Capac's life is said to be dedicated to these northern wars. One of the Inca campaigns in other parts of the empire that receives mention is a second expedition against the Chirihuanos, in which the ruler did not personally take part. At the end of his reign, he visited the island of Puna, returned to Quito, and died. Cobal's data for this reign obviously derive from virtually the same sources as those used by Sarmiento and Cabello. The first part, likewise designated A, includes basically the same places referred to by the other 2 chroniclers. It differs mainly in adding a visit to Quito to the account of the Chachapoyas expedition, placing this before rather than after the first part of the southward expedition. Thus, the ruler supposedly headed south to Callao, then north all the way to Quito, and once more southward to Colasuyu. The last part of the A series speaks of Mojos and Chirihuanos, exactly as in Cabello's version, and recounts the reconstruction of the fortress of Pocona, again described as having originally been built by Huanacapac's father. The remainder of Cabello's account, designated Part B, is a little more than a resume of Sarmiento and Cabello, giving, for example, the same names for generals involved in the Pastos campaign and briefly describing the same massacre at Yaguacocha. Cobo includes a visit to the coastal region towards the end of the reign, an event also mentioned by Cabello and Sarmiento. Cieza de Leon's much earlier account presents certain problems. In many respects, Cieza agrees with the other sources. Like them, he writes of an initial phase in Huanacapac's reign involving a southward campaign via Colao as far as Chile and a defeat by the Chirihuanos. Following this, the Inca proceeded to Cajamarca and, as at the beginning of the reign in the Cabello version, attacked the Chachapoyas, suffering 2 defeats before finally prevailing. Cieza then describes a visit to the coast, and the remainder of his catalogue of places resembles closely that of Part B of the Sarmiento-Cabello account, including the Yaguacocha episode and the Pastos War. At this stage, however, a most curious aspect of Cieza's reports needs to be considered, with the exception of the last part B in Table 2, which basically coincides with the Sarmiento-Cabello version. Much of his account of Huanacapac's reign amounts to little more than a repetition of what he tells himself of Tupac. In both reigns, as Cieza has it, the ruler first visited Colasuyu. Tupac then merely sent messengers, i.e. made plans for war, against Antisuyu, whereas Huanacapac actually attacked the wild Chirihuanos. Following this, the two rulers pursued an identical route. Chacha, Bonbon, Cajamarca, Chachapoyas, Bracamoros, Cachas, Ayahuaca, Huancabamba, Tumebamba, Puruaves, Lacatunga, Quito. In the accounts of each reign, a few additional names are included in the northern march to Quito, for example. Tiquizambi follows Tumebamba in the first, and Riobamba is mentioned in the second. The order of places named also differs, but only slightly. Unlike the other chroniclers, Cieza reports attacks by both rulers on the savage Bracamoros, whom he described in another context as living in the mountains east of the town of Ayahuaca near the present-day border between Peru and Ecuador. But the setbacks reportedly suffered both by Tupac and by Huanacapac are described in identical words. He entered and turned in flight, entro y volvió huyendo. In the first instance, the defeat is attributed to the harsh terrain, and in the second, to the ferocity of the inhabitants. Cieza's memoir of his own visit to southern Ecuador is far more detailed than his historical report on conquests, and in this account, also he writes of the Bracamoros and tells how the Inca ruler, in this case Huanacapac, turned and fled, volvió huyendo, after his encounter with these savages. The uncanny resemblance between descriptions of the two rulers' campaigns in Cieza's relatively early account raises a fundamental problem. Spanish chroniclers at this stage might have been able to obtain from informants reasonably accurate historical data on Huanacapac, then still of recent memory, whereas the deeds of Tupac were already at least partly forgotten. Hence, informants might in certain cases have attributed to Tupac feats that were in fact carried out by his successor, only omitting those wars in northern Ecuador, known by all to have been fought by Huanacapac rather than by Tupac. Garcilaso also recounts at length the triumphs of Huanacapac, offering a version that has much in common with the others but placing events in a different order. Here, the Inca first conquered the province of Quito, including tribes farther to the north. He descended thence to the coast, and a long description follows of his confrontation with the people at Tumbes and other places. He then undertook an expedition to Charcas in Chile before returning to the north where, among other events, a massacre of his enemies occurred at Yaguacocha. Betanzos writes in rather general terms of a visit to Colao by Huanacapac, who then continued to Cochabamba. His version of this reign includes only a fair brief report on the northern campaign, mentioning Yaguacocha, but omitting many other accounts of battles against local tribes. The long and the short. Having reviewed the principal reports of the different campaigns of the last two emperors before the arrival of the Spaniards, I would like to add a few comments on the chroniclers' treatment of the conquest of specific regions before considering the archaeological evidence as to the fullest extent of such conquests. Their reports, particularly the more detailed versions of Sarmiento and Cabello, offer long accounts of wars in the Andean region of Ecuador and northern Peru, whereas their writings on yet more extensive conquests in the south are short. Though this emphasis may be appropriate for the reign of Huayna who made of Tumebamba a second capital and clearly spent much of his life in Ecuador, it can hardly constitute a very comprehensive account of the achievements of Tupac, who reportedly conquered a vast territory south of Cusco comprising parts of Bolivia, northwestern Argentina, and Chile, regions in which the depth and extent of the Inca penetration are becoming more closely defined by archaeological research. Equally, the extreme brevity of the chroniclers' mention of the conquest of the great kingdom of Timor serves as a reminder of the rather selective nature of their record of Inca military history. Andean Ecuador. Some confusion over Ecuadorian conquests arises from the widespread tradition to the effect that Tupac was the conqueror not only of Quito but also of much of the far northern empire. Cieza even credits him with originating the establishment of a new Cusco in Quito, although the great temples and palaces that Cieza himself saw were in Tumebamba. Salman accordingly contrasts the high ideological pretensions of the Inca city with the small quantity of Inca remains that have been unearthed in Quito. Tumebamba, presumably first conquered by Tupac, became Huayna Capac's principal base in Ecuador. Much of the surrounding region had already been absorbed in Tupac's reign, but as Larrea points out, we do not really know how far Tupac conquered beyond Tumebamba. Cabello states that it was Huayna Capac who spent 10 years in the conquest of the territory between Quito and the present-day northern frontier of Ecuador. Plaza Schuler cites a local source, Jerónimo Puento, as making the same statement, which is also repeated by Pedro Pizarro. Puento, whose work dates from 1586, was himself a chieftain of the Cayambi people, whose traditions so vividly recalled their struggles against the Incas. Plaza Schuler expresses the conviction that Tupac's incursions into the Quito region were mainly exploratory and that Huayna Capac was the real conqueror. He also cites Alonso de Borregan to that effect. Reports differ as to the final extent of Huayna Capac's northern conquests. The available evidence suggests a rather loose frontier more or less following the present-day border between Colombia and Ecuador. Cobo states that Huayna Capac had extended his rule beyond the town of Pasto, some 50 miles inside that border, and that the Incas were in the process of conquering the province of Popayan at the time of the Spanish invasion. Many chroniclers report that the northern borders of the empire coincided with a river called the Rio Angasamayo. Romale de Avery identifies the Rio Angasamayo, sometimes confused with the River Mayo, with either the present-day Rio Carchi or the Rio Gaitada. The Carchi would seem to be the more correct identification, as it does run east-west on a line approximately coinciding with a stretch of the Colombian-Ecuadorian border. The same author points out that any notion that southwestern Colombia was conquered by the Incas may arise from the presence of Pasto tribes on both sides of the present-day border. Those of Ecuador were indeed conquered, but those living on the northern side of that border were not. Mura also writes of Pastos living on both sides of the Colombian-Ecuadorian border. Cabello makes what seems to be a reasonable appraisal. He states that Huayna Capac contemplated the conquests of the more northerly Pastos. He reached the fortress of Rumichacha, near the border town of Ipiales, and sent his captains to explore the territory. But the inhabitants were so poor and so savage that the ruler decided to proceed no farther than the Rio Angasamayo. Though the Incas perhaps made forays into southwestern Colombia, the absence of Inca sites and pottery confirms the impression that they never controlled the region. By far the liveliest account, as well as the fullest, of Huayna Capac's Ecuadorian wars is given by Cabello. The same events are recorded by Sarmiento, but Cabello adds colorful details and offers a blow-by-blow description of a prolonged and hard-fought campaign. He himself spent several years in Quito before he wrote his book in 1586, and the author knew descendants of local chieftains who surely still cherished certain traditions of battles fought by their forebears in the early part of the century. A point stressed by Cabello and other chroniclers is the frequency with which the Incas, in hiding these ferocious tribes, suffered stunning defeats before they finally triumphed. They were initially repulsed by the Pastos, but among their most inveterate foes were the Caranquis. On their first encounter with this tribe, the Orejones were driven back with huge losses, and the ruler himself thrown to the ground and had to be rescued by his guard. In another attack on a Caranqui fort, Auquitopa, the Inca's brother was killed. The description of the final and most dramatic event in the war serves as a good example of Cabello's lively narrative. For 5 whole days, the Incas attacked a fort defended by the Caranquis, Cayambis in Sarmiento's version, but were unable to breach its defenses. Before the 5th attack, Huayna Capac ordered 2 generals commanding a substantial force to remain at a certain distance from the fort and to occupy a strategic point from which they could see how the attack fared. Thereafter, an assault followed, but this was only a feigned attack, and after it had seemingly failed, the ruler ordered a retreat. The unsuspecting Caranquis duly sallied forth from their stronghold in hot pursuit. Meanwhile, the second Inca force, commanded by the 2 generals, was able to penetrate the now unguarded fort with part of its strength, while the remainder, together with the soldiers under the ruler's direct command, fell upon the Caranquis who had made the sally. Surrounded on all sides, the defenders floundered in a nearby marsh of reeds, where they either drowned or were slaughtered. The locality was henceforth known as Yahuacocha, the Lake of Blood. The coast. Cieza, and to an even greater extent Garcilasco, enlarges upon Inca wars of conquest against the coast of Ecuador and the Tumbes region, across the present-day Peruvian border. Accounts of these expeditions, which were usually launched from Quito or Tumebamba, engendered the notion that this region became a province of the Inca Empire. However, as early as 1946, Murray denied that the Incas controlled the area, and Hislop stresses that there is no good archaeological evidence of any such control. The absence of Inca sites or even pottery on the Ecuadorian coast serves to establish that the incursions of Tupac and his successor did not lead to outright control. In addition, though the chroniclers state that the Incas fought wars and won victories, their reports leave somewhat open the question of whether the Ecuadorian coast was truly conquered. Cieza merely states that the Huayna Capac sent expeditions in order to try to subject the natives of Guayaquil and Puerto Viejo. The Incas fought battles and won some victories, but also suffered defeats. In describing his own visit to that region, Cieza states that he found no Inca sites or storehouses. Some of the natives told him that they were never conquered, but others refuted this statement. Cabello writes that at the end of his reign, Huayna Capac visited the island of Puna and was well received, but this is hardly the description of a conquest. Cobo reports that the ruler fought against the people of Puna, but that after he left, the latter massacred the Inca garrison. In contrast to the chroniclers' ample digressions on expeditions to the Tumbes region, their descriptions of the conquest of the rich kingdom of Timor are extremely meager, notwithstanding the importance of this extensive realm. Cieza, in a mere paragraph, mentions fierce Chimu resistance to an Inca attack made from the direction of Tumbes. Sarmiento suggests in an even briefer passage that Tupac himself did not lead this attack on Timor. Cabello, after reporting an initial assault on Timor from Tupac's base in Cajamarca, writes of a final conquest by an army proceeding from Tumbes, after which the defeated ruler was carried off to Cusco. All accounts stress the immense store of treasure found in the capital, Chanchan. The sources generally mention the conquest of the southern part of the Peruvian coast. Cieza, for instance, reports that Tupac, after the assault on Timor, visited the great shrine of Pachacamac, where consulted the oracle. He then proceeded to establish control over major principalities such as Nazca and Chincha. At first sight, the notion that principalities with a long tradition of independence should surrender their freedom with little or no resistance might seem far-fetched. However, such reports acquired a certain credibility in view of the Inca's commanders' ability to mobilize subject peoples and hence to achieve such a crushing superiority in numbers as to render resistance almost futile. In addition, in desert regions on the coast, the invaders could deal the defenders a deadly blow and even force their submission by cutting off the irrigation canals on which they depended for their food supply. Such vital intakes, of which some but not all were protected by fortresses and walls, were naturally vulnerable. Those of the Lima and Lurin valleys lacked any such defenses. Collao and beyond. For the key province of Collao, reports of expeditions by Tupac and his successor tend to be brief. As we have already seen, the absorption of the principal centers of the Colla, who according to some had been initially as much allies as subjects, had reportedly occurred before Pachacutec delegated the military command to Tupac. Cieza mentions a war against Cari, the ruler of Chucuito, early in Tupac's reign. In the Sarmiento and Cabello versions, a campaign against the Collas occurs at a later stage. Both accounts mention enemy fortresses with similar names, as well as the same 2 leaders, skinned and made into drums. One of these forts, simply called Pucara, is also mentioned by Cieza. Beyond Collao lay rich and fertile provinces of the empire, but information on how they were acquired is minimal. Ciesa, Sarmiento, and Cobo mention briefly that Tupac campaigned in Charcas, a region situated to the southwest of Cochabamba, after which he went on to Chile. Visits to Cochabamba itself are described by Sarmiento and Cabello as occurring early in the reign of Wanaka, followed by a visit to Pocona between Cochabamba and Charcas, where the ruler rebuilt the fortress. In contrast to their meager reports on conquest beyond Colao, these sources write extensively about rather abortive attacks on certain savage mountain tribes of Antisuyu on the eastern frontier of the empire. According to Sarmiento and Cabello, Tupac first campaigned against these peoples after his Ecuadorian expedition, though Cobo maintains that this assault occurred at the beginning of Tupac's reign. Initially, the Chunchos were attacked. Casavitz places this tribe mentioned in the Sarmiento and Cabello accounts, as listed in Appendix A, some distance to the east of Cusco. Cabello also reports an abortive campaign conducted by Wanaka against the Mojos before he reached Pocona. Sagnes argues that Guncho and Mojo are more generic terms than names of specific tribes. The name Mojo he considers to be of Aymara origin. Wanaka, in addition to battling the Mojos, also reportedly fought the Chirihuanos, situated farther to the southeast. According to Ciesa, the latter attack ended in a disastrous defeat. Farther to the south, however, ethno-historical material on Inca penetration of northwest Argentina is almost non-existent, though as we shall later see in discussing imperial boundaries, archaeological research of frontier fortresses help us define the limits of Inca rule, both in southern Bolivia and Argentina. The four sources of Tables 1 and 2 state, probably correctly, that Tupac conquered northern Chile, but details are scarce. Sarmiento devotes a few lines to Juan Capac's expedition to Chile after stating that part of Chile was conquered by Tupac. Repeating the names of the two principal chiefs, Michimalongo and Antalongo, he writes of the occupation of Coquimbo, about 100 miles north of Santiago, and Copiapo. Cabello also mentions Tupac's conquest of Coquimbo. Ciesa, after describing Juan Capac's occupation of Tucumán in northwestern Argentina, states that this ruler passed a year fighting the Chilean tribes, building numerous fortresses and abducting many inhabitants. The discovery of Inca remains, whether cemeteries, roads, or fortresses, together with studies of regional documents, demonstrate that the conquest of Chile was not a once-and-for-all event accompanied by accomplished by a single ruler in one campaign. Although Tucumán apparently offered less opposition than other provinces, according to the historical record, the invaders encountered total rejection in Chile and had to fight battles in valley after valley. Leonardo León cites sources that tell of the stiff resistance encountered in Chile. Inca expansion probably continued in Huayna Campac's reign, but such conquests may be attributed more to the Inca's generals than to the ruler himself. Bounds of empire. Up to this point, the process and extent of Inca conquest have been reviewed as they are described by the traditional chroniclers. In certain cases, comments by purely local chroniclers also offer some additional information. But in recent times, much has been added to our knowledge both of the extent of the Inca conquest and of the intensity of their cultural penetration by archaeological research. The degree to which the Inca culture was imposed on a region clearly varied, as did the extent to which its inhabitants became loyal subjects or remained recalcitrant rebels. The natives' disposition depended partly on the length of time since a given region had first been invaded. Even in the case of the Cañadis, reportedly subjugated by Tupac, loyalty remained divided until Juan Capac's reign. Jaime Hidrovo cites evidence that although Tupac dominated the central Cañari region, tribes to the north of the Cuenca Valley recovered their independence and had to be reconquered by his successor. Some of the results of contemporary research were discovered in a symposium on Inca frontiers held in Bogota in 1985. The overall summary of the border problem offered by John Hislop at the symposium may serve as the basis for a few relevant comments. Hislop, in referring to a renewed interest in this Inca frontier problem, stresses the need to combine the archaeological evidence with an intensified use of early legal and administrative documents and with a more critical evaluation of the classical chroniclers. In the past, Inca borders have been defined mainly through evidence in the early written sources. However, after nearly 70 years of archaeology, it is now becoming evident that Inca pottery, wherever found in any quantity, is a clear indicator of the presence of the Inca state. Far less well studied, but of great potential utility for the definition of boundaries, are Inca forts. As more of these are located and investigated, they help to define, for some areas, the outermost Inca boundary as well as earlier boundaries achieved before subsequent expansions. Hence, archaeology may be expected to play an ever-increasing role, as much can be learned simply by mapping the points where Inca pottery has been located. If we find Inca pottery present in a given site but absent from a place, say, 10 kilometers south, then in that instance a border can sometimes but not always be established. Much remains to be done in this and in other respects. On the basis of information now available, large sectors of the frontier still remain poorly defined, particularly in northern Peru and in southern Bolivia. Existing maps of an Inca presence in these regions may contain major errors and tend to conflict with the latest findings. The extreme northern frontier in Ecuador has been discussed above, with the view that it approximately coincided with the present Ecuadorian-Colombian border. Hislop concludes that Inca incursions into southern Colombia probably did occur, even if they did not result in outright conquest. Reports of such conquest may arise, as previously mentioned, from the presence of pastos on both sides of this border. Equally, as already stressed, the inclination to treat coastal Ecuador as an Inca province is no longer acceptable because of the scarcity of archaeological evidence of an Inca presence and the tendency of some chroniclers to describe expeditions by Inca rulers to Tumbes, Porto Viejo, and other sites as incursions rather than as conquests. Inca pottery is notable by its absence in these places. Vast stretches of the Inca frontiers in Bolivia and Peru still defy precise demarcation. Not one frontier fortress has been located in present-day Peru. The Visita of Ortiz de Zúñiga mentions 3 or 4 forts east of Huánuco, garrisoned by Mirame settlers from Cusco. These have not been located, but the report suggests that at least part of this eastern border was fortified. However, here again, if forts are eventually located, they cannot necessarily be taken as marking the final limits of the empire. They may have been constructed well behind the ultimate bounds of expansion. Alternatively, as surely occurred in Ecuador, some might be the strongholds of their adversaries rather than those of the Incas themselves. Leading chroniclers, though virtually ignoring the long borders stretching from southern Bolivia to far off Chile, lend a certain prominence to Inca campaigns against the mysterious Mojos and Chonchos who lived astride part of the eastern boundary of the empire. The tribes are usually described as savages, and the Incas, in fighting them, gain few laurels. Sagnes, after discussing the uncertain etymology of the names of these tribes, suggests that the Incas had seized control of only part of their territory, which consisted of foothills rich in jungle vegetation and lay between the upper reaches of the Rio Madre de Dios and the Rio Beni. In general, these sources insist on the Incas' reluctance to absorb savage peoples, though Strube, among others, suspects that they penetrated the Amazonic jungle to a greater extent than this is generally admitted. Most of the remaining frontier in Bolivia, southeast of Cochabamba, is ill-defined. The area to the west of Santa Cruz is now considered to have formed part of the empire following the investigation of the site of Samaipata. Yet Rodolfo Rafino describes a whole series of sites farther south, beyond Potosi, most of them lying between latitude 20 and 22, with obvious signs of Inca occupation. The most significant of these is Chipihuayco, where the ruins cover an area of 20 hectares and include a complex irrigation system. Another site, Chiquiago, occupies a comparable area. Its location on an imposing hill with a panoramic view in all directions might imply a certain strategic significance. It was supplied with water by a system of aqueducts. An important Inca road crosses the site from north to south. Rafino also lists the different types of Inca pottery found in the various localities. However, it should be noted that these sites stand at some 3,000 meters above sea level, and we do not know to what extent the Incas controlled the intermediate territory down toward the foothills of the Cordillera. In northwest Argentina, certain more positive indications exist. Archaeologists have identified many Inca sites, often more easy to locate in Argentina than in Bolivia because of their greater proximity to modern highways. In contrast, few historical sources exist for this sector. Early colonial data indicate that Santiago del Estero was a Quechua-speaking zone, which led to an initial assumption that it lay within Inca territory. But this view now tends to be questioned because it has been demonstrated that Quechua was introduced by Spanish missionaries. Traditional accounts place the extreme southern limit of Inca rule on the Rio Male or even farther south on the Rio Biobío. Hislop, however, cites fairly extensive evidence to the effect that the Incas secured firm control only as far as the Rio Maipo Valley, south of Santiago. The southernmost Inca remains so far discovered are the cemetery of Nos in San Jose de Maipo and the fortress of Chena, both situated less than 20 kilometers south of Santiago. The Chilean chronicler Jerónimo de Bibar confirms this viewpoint when he writes of an Inca expedition against the Pomorcayes, who fled to the southern side of the Rio Maule. The Incas did not absorb the land of the Pomorcayes, whose northern limit lay 7 leagues south of Santiago. Osvaldo Silva Galdames interprets the letters of the Spanish conquistador Pedro de Valdivia as implying that the Incas never conquered beyond the Rio Mapocho. According to Dillahey, there may be a consensus among modern investigators that the strictly political frontier lay somewhere between Rio Maipo and the Rio Maule, traditionally described as the southernmost limit of conquest. But in this instance, a purely geo-economic border farther to the south marked another zone not under Inca military control but lying within the Araucanian homeland. To the north of the political frontier, Inca forts have been found, indicating full subjection to their rule. Dillahey cites Bibar as stating that he saw a gold mine south of this line, and pottery showing clear signs of Inca influence has been located between Temuco and Valdivia, over 100 miles south of the Rio Maipo. Dillahey thus proposes the existence of islands of Inca activity well to the south of the formal frontier. The mines were seemingly worked by Inca Llanas, as no archaeological or ethno-historical evidence suggests that the Araucanos ever exploited gold mines. Hence, though the ferocity of the local resistance and the immensity of the distance from Cusco may have limited the extent of the Incas' control over present-day Chile, there is a certain economic involvement in Araucano territory, but without full military protection. Chronological pitfalls. In considering the Inca process of expansion, another question arises. Though indications do survive as to the places conquered by each Inca, does any reliable method exist of dating either regions or conquests? An initial obstacle is a tendency for chroniclers to tell a similar story twice over, ascribing similar events to two different reigns, as for instance, Cies's word-for-word repetition of the tale of Tupac's abortive attack on the Bracamoros in his account of Huanaka's wars. We still do not know whether this rather ignominious setback, described in identical terms, really applies to one reign or to the other. The sources repeatedly refer to attempts, often unsuccessful, to tame savage groups such as the Mojos, Chunchos, and Chachapoyas, but we ignore the question of whether such attempts were repeated in two reigns or whether single onslaughts are reported twice over by the chroniclers. Early writers on Inca ethnohistory were naturally interested in chronology. Because the Inca quipus served to record numbers and statistics, it seemed logical to assume that they would have included among their store of data at least the number of years that each king reigned. However, it later became apparent that the quipus recorded only matters of real concern to the Incas themselves rather than information of more interest to their conquerors. For such concerns, any form of chronology was notably absent. Among initial studies of the problem may be cited that of Philip A. Means, who dates the Inca conquest of the Lake Titicaca Basin to AD 1200, of the south coast to AD 1300, and of the north coast to AD 1400. In his Biblioteca Andina, Means divides the Spanish chroniclers into two schools, the Garcilascan, postulating a slow process of expansion, and the Toledan, which limits the conquest of empire to the last four reigns. Posing the question of whether territory more than 50 miles from Cusco had been gained before Pachacutec's reign, he lists 13 chroniclers who say no and 8 who say yes. Subsequently, Rowe, in a more far-reaching study of the chronology of the Inca conquest, expresses the conviction that, in general terms, the no list is the more valid of the two. To the no list being the four principal accounts of conquests, Ciesa, Sarmiento, Cabello, and Cobo. Moreover, the no list embraces all those who finished their works in the 16th century and hence were closer to the Incas than were later writers. Rowe, who basically accepts the traditional list of 12 rulers, then suggests dates for those who reigned from the death of Viracocha to the accession of Huascar. Pachacutec supposedly ruled from 1438 to 1471, Tupac from 1471 to 1493, and Wanaka from 1493 to 1525. These dates are derived from Cabello de Balboa. Rowe simply describes them as so plausible that they cannot be easily dismissed. Other writers have also attempted to place certain conquests in a firm chronological framework. For instance, Larrea, though agreeing that it is impossible to establish the date of Huayna birth, suggests that the reconquest of Quito would have taken place in 1494, whereas the subjugation of northern Ecuador probably may have dated to 1499. On the same basis, he calculates that Tupac himself established himself in Tumebamba between 1465 and 1470. Rowe was probably correct in opting for a rapid process of conquest, as opposed to Garcilaso and others, who credit earlier rulers with spectacular triumphs. Though he describes Cabello's dates as generally plausible, Rowe concedes that we will probably never be able to date the Inca reigns exactly because the Inca themselves took no interest in the passage of years. Cabello, though he wrote as late as 1856, might have been better placed than any other chronicler to evolve some system of dating for the northern part of the empire because of his contacts with the descendants of the pre-conquest nobility of Ecuador. Nonetheless, the existence of any real Inca chronology in terms of precise dates for reigns or conquests has continued to be questioned. In particular, Whedon insists that such dates simply cannot be determined. According to this author, such attempts are based on uncertain assumptions. He points out that, in realistic terms, we don't even know whether the exact date of Pizarro's first landing was 1527 or 1528. Whedon further argues that if it is impossible to fix the date of the last ruler, then we lack a starting point for a backward count, using the years of reign traditionally ascribed to each monarch. According to Whedon, the Incas simply took no interest in preserving information on the number of years of reign or life of their sovereign. It was possible for them to do so by using the quipus, but they obviously saw no point in it. In another study, Whedon demonstrates in more detail that we cannot determine the exact date of Huayna death. According to Francisco de Chetas, whose account was published as early as 1534, Atahuallpa in 1532 told his captor Pizarro that Huayna had died 8 years earlier, i.e. in 1524. But Ciesa implies that this monarch died in 1527, whereas Cabello states that his death occurred in 1525. Though he admits that it is conceivable that Cabello found some Indian who knew the chronology of Inca reigns, Whedon considers the probability of this somewhat remote. The only date we possess for Inca history is 1532, the year in which Pizarro took Atahuallpa captive and in which Huascar died. In effect, therefore, the year in which the empire collapsed. Whedon, who also accepts the concept of a fairly rapid process of conquest, nonetheless expresses doubts as to whether, in terms of sheer distance involved, this process might not have been stretched over more than 3 reigns and therefore might have begun before the episode of the Chanca War. The question remains as to whether, if we cannot establish their dates, we might at least determine with some assurance the sequence in which conquest took place. As can be seen from tables 1 and 2, the leading chroniclers enable us to make certain deductions for the last 2 reigns, but they are by no means conclusive. Moreover, as Salman points out, mid-16th century documents recording detailed Spanish field studies made in highland Ecuador and Colombia during the period 1557 to 1571 for the purpose of fixing tribute quotas do assist in the establishment of an approximate overall sequence, region by region, in the case of Ecuador. Salman offers evidence that the Otavalo region north of Quito was conquered later than Quito itself, whereas the Purua country farther to the south was subdued some time before this. He also quotes Valdemar Espinosa as demonstrating that the decisive battle of Yahuarcocha, dated by Cabello at 1492, is not likely to have taken place before 1500. Mirames, stationed near Quito, had passed through only 2 generations of political leadership by 1577, so the colony could hardly have been founded much before 1500. As another very generalized indication of the sequence of conquest, Myers points out that although Quito is often described as a second Cusco, and is reported by sources as already having been occupied by Tupac, this is a claim that existing archaeological evidence cannot support. Quito contains no Inca architectural remains and does not fulfill the conditions necessary to qualify as an imperial capital, as opposed to Tumebamba, or originally excavated by Max Seol. Many other main surviving Inca sites are concentrated around Cuenca, modern-day Tumebamba, and offer proof of the reported Incaization of the Cañaris. Myers quotes Seol as stating that Quito did not exist in pre-Inca times, and that even its existence as an Inca settlement remains somewhat problematical. Contrived history. The chroniclers of the 1540s and even the 1550s clearly had access to valuable sources of information. These are described in some detail in Ciesa's Señorio, with direct references to leading Incas. As related in his Chronica, Cieza is in a southward journey not only saw the ruins of the great palaces of Tumebamba, but actually visited the lake of Yahuacocha, still marked on modern maps, and would surely have encountered people, perhaps by then in their 60s, who retained memories of an event as dramatic as a war with the Incas. Cieza conversed with the people of Tumbes about Huayna visit, discussing such details as the presentation to the ruler of a gift of wild animals. He also cites local papers of the treachery of the chieftain of the island of Puna, who plied the ruler with gifts, but later killed many of his orejones. In studying Cieza's information, however, we must explain the rather disconcerting similarity between his descriptions of certain campaigns of Tupac and Wanaka. It was suggested above that at least some events attributed to Tupac, such as the conquest of Quito, were really a kind of anticipation of the deeds of Wanaka. At the time when the earlier chroniclers wrote, not only cantares but also personal recollections of some events of this reign could still have survived, whereas memories of many of the feats of Tupac might have become blurred. Tupac's expeditions tend to be presented as an almost continuous campaign carried to the four quarters of the empire. As Pease points out, the sources at times appear to relate these conquests in a kind of ritual context. To quote Salman, in the authors hospitable to an early version of conquest chronology, there are recurrent motives so regular as to suggest that events have been cast in the mold of ideal normative structures. Northern conquests are almost always told in a stereotyped form in which Tupac Inca, the father, conquers the northern barbarians, but is then betrayed by them, after which Huayna Capac, the son, must reconquer the quote-unquote rebellious native lords. It is likely that such sequences did occur. It thus seems that for the conquest prior to those of Huayna Capac, we possess a corpus of data based in historical fact, but at times presented in somewhat ritualized form, and with a tendency for the account of earlier events in Inca history to reflect those of more recent times. Such ambiguities have naturally perplexed contemporary ethnohistorians, though their views may be hard to categorize. On this question, one may cite Brian Bauer, whose opinions I am not wholly in discord on such matters as the time depth of Inca settlement in the Cusco Valley, or even on the historical, as opposed to the legendary, role of Pachacutec in the Inca history. However, I find it harder to accept Bauer's rather cursory division of scholars into three groups. In the first group, he places those who accept the traditional interpretations of Inca history, a category that somewhat paradoxically includes John Rowe, who is often described as the pioneer of modern investigation of the sources and whose archaeological studies of Cusco are of significant value. The second group views the Inca state as developed through the time as the result of transformations of social, economic, and religious institutions, a definition that, in plainer language, presumably refers to those who treat the sources as historical but insist on the need for caution in their interpretation. Bauer's third category comprises researchers who deny to the chroniclers any role as direct or literal interpretations of the past. Only Tom Zuidema and Pierre Duvials are cited as scholars who fit into the third category. But it is surely worth recalling that the hypothesis of a dual Inca monarchy, as described in Chapter 2, derives from the detailed study by Zuidema and Duvials of the very chroniclers whose role as interpreters of past events they supposedly deny. In a more recent work, Zuidema writes more constructively of compressed history, a concept applied by Geoffrey Conrad to the dynastic list of the kings of Timor, in which certain rulers are suppressed. Zuidema suggests that the same principle may have applied to the Inca king list. He points out that the more recent and complete version of the Chronicle of Betanzos implies that there was a king between Pachacutec and Tupac Inca. Bauer commends those scholars who challenge the validity of literal interpretations of the chronicles, but those who accept the more literal interpretations of Inca history are almost an extinct species. The great majority of scholars, whether ethnohistorians or archaeologists, surely adhere to Bauer's second group, to which I might also be said to belong, though I do not reject his third group outright. Far from denying Zuidema's notion of compressed history, see my discussion in Chapter 3 of the possible suppression of the reign of Urco. One might suggest that this concept could entail the elimination not only of rulers, but also of certain events from the record. To quote a single specific instance, the long and glorious history of the Kingdom of Timor is amply portrayed in Michael Mosley and Alana Collins's The Northern Dynasties. Moreover, in this volume, militarism is described by Teresa Lange Topic as an important element in Chimu statecraft, a point confirmed by archaeological research, which offers much data on battles fought on fought in on forts quickly constructed and conquered areas. Hence, the chroniclers report that Tupac absorbed this great realm with minimal resistance or, in certain accounts, none at all, tends to lack credibility. This could be tentatively interpreted as the possible suppression of an event or a series of events in the standard record, notwithstanding the obvious possibility that parts of the Chimu realm, such as Lambayeque, might have welcomed the invaders. The surviving Incas tended to portray themselves to be somewhat credulous Spanish as people whose forebears bestowed an orderly welfare state on lesser peoples. They were perhaps less eager to tell Viceroy Toledo's stories of wars waged to ravage more sophisticated realms, such as Timor, and forcibly to incorporate them into the Inca Empire. Hence, Suidama's notion of compressed history might be extended to embrace the suppression not only of rulers but also of events. A temptation, therefore, naturally arises to treat all Inca history as contrived, presented merely as a justification for certain episodes rather than as a record of what occurred. But it must equally be borne in mind that the manipulation of history to serve as propaganda, a not unfamiliar characteristic of our own century, was also practiced among literate societies of the past, such as Sumer, Babylonia, Vedic India, and even Imperial China. A common source? It may be somewhat easy for investigators to divine likely sources of information available to early writers such as Ciesa and Betanzos. However, determining the derivation of the much larger store of camping data compiled decades later by Sarmiento and Cabello presents more complex problems. The extremely close correspondence between parts of these two accounts, as illustrated in Appendix A, implies that they were based largely on common sources. However, the marked disparities to be found on the text, in particular Cabello's wholly different spelling and his omission of some of the leaders and places named by Sarmiento, along with the addition of many others, suggest that one author was not simply copied by the other. Some of Cabello's more dramatic passages presumably derived from data gleaned during his stay in Quito. The major question then arises as to the identity of any such common source or sources. As an initial premise, one may presume that when the Viceroy Toledo commissioned Sarmiento to write his history, it would have become very hard, after an interval of nearly 4 decades, to compile solely from informants' personal reminiscences a sequence of names and events as detailed and intricate as the one he and Cabello offer. As we shall later see, Sarmiento indeed consulted Orejones living in Cusco, many of royal lineage and married to Spaniards. However, unless one believes that such individuals could have offered, in 1572, memorized data copious enough to provide the substance of Sarmiento's history, so replete with names, one might be tempted to conclude that his account of fairly remote events was little more than ritualized saga enriched by sheer invention. But this conclusion, in effect, denies basic authenticity to a seemingly serious attempt to retrieve the past, even if, at Toledo's prompting, the attempt was not altogether impartial. Hence, we should not exclude the possibility that some much earlier written material, now lost, was available in the 1570s and used by Sarmiento and Cabello. Such material could have derived, say, from the early 1550s, just after the time that Ciesa and Betanzos completed their own works, and then served as the basis for much of the information later obtained by Sarmiento. In the early 1570s, numerous descendants of Inca rulers still lived in the Cayoche barrio of Cusco. Unaided by more formal records produced by a previous generation, these surviving Incas could surely have offered Sarmiento and Cabello at least some useful data based on local traditions and from what their fathers and grandfathers had told them. Among the more prominent of such Orejones was Carlos Inca. Born in 1537, he was the son of Atahuallpa's brother Paulu, and like many other Incas, had married a Spaniard. He lived in great splendor and was apparently literate, if we can judge from copies of a letter he sent to the King of Spain in 1571. Cayo Tupac, who had already been consulted by Ciesa, was still alive. He was born in about 1502, and his father had been the second person or chief assistant to Wanaka and a close confederate of Huascar. A grandson of Atahuallpa, Alonso Tito Atauchi, was also consulted by Toledo and Sarmiento. Both these and other leading Incas were at that time under immense pressure, as Toledo was determined to stamp out the last vestiges of Inca resistance to Spanish control. Carlos himself was arrested by Toledo, whereas Tupac Amaru, son of the rebel emperor, was executed in 1572. Many leading Incas of Cusco were subsequently exiled to Mexico. Moreover, the Incas of post-conquest Cusco, shorn of power, probably led a rather otiose life. Perhaps they relieved the tedium of eventless days by reciting the deeds of past heroes, whose names they endlessly recalled. But however desperate the need of this Inca coterie to curry favor with the Spaniards at that moment, one still wonders how they could have produced from memory such a vast compendium of the details of Inca history, a subject in which their interest was at best limited. Even supposing that they did perform this prodigious task, a further question remains unresolved. How, if Sarmiento's store of information was a product of sheer memory rather than of recorded data, could it occur that some years later Carmelo also extracted these verbal data in so similar a form? As already stressed, Carmelo's very different spelling limits the likelihood that he simply copied Sarmiento, if indeed any copy of the latter's work might have been available. A comparable situation prevails in Mexico, where there is a virtual consensus of ethnohistorians on the probable existence of some lost document or documents, now commonly known as the Chronica X, recorded much earlier than the most detailed surviving sources. This idea was originally proposed by R. H. Barlow in 1945. He pointed out that though the long works on Aztec history by Fray Diego Duran and Alvarado Tesosomoc are very similar indeed, sufficient differences exist to show that one could not have been copied directly from the other or from another text, known as the Codex Ramirez, that is almost a resume of the work of Duran. Tesosomoc and Duran wrote in the 1580s, i.e., even longer after the arrival of the Spaniards in their country, 1519, than the corresponding interval for Sarmiento. Accordingly, Barlow, for lack of any alternative explanation, tentatively proposed that the histories on which we depend for so much detailed and vivid material on the Aztecs, material lacking in previous accounts, mainly derived from some lost earlier texts which he called the Chronica X. He suggested that such a work might have been the work of Fray Juan de Tovar. Of course, it may be argued that the Mesoamericans' use of a pictographic writing system, together with the means of recording dates in 52-year cycles, would have made it much easier to produce such a document as the Chronica X in Mexico than in Peru. However, even though copies of pre-Columbian codices that no longer exist today, given the general absence of surviving originals from the Valley of Mexico itself, might in 1580 have offered additional evidence on past events, the chronicles of Tesosomoc and Duran contain many extract notions, together with detailed accounts of events that could hardly derive from pictorial codices. Moreover, the two historians' dating of events is sketchy, whereas events in historical codices are commonly linked to specific years of the native calendar. What is more, these chronicles are not principal sources for tentative attempts to reconstruct an Aztec chronology. As in the specific and known instance of Sahagun's 12 volumes, it seems more probable that much of their information originally derived from earlier accounts given verbally by informants and recorded in writing by literate Spaniards. Had any such lost document as the hypothetical Chronica X existed in Peru, it will logically have been recorded in the early years after the conquest. Barlow proposes that the Chronica X dates from not more than 20 years after the conquest of Mexico. It could have been based on one or more historical traditions, including perhaps some that were familiar to Cieza. The latter, in paraphrasing the Quipucamayos, also stresses the role of cantares, which recorded the main events of a king's reign and were to be sung only after his death, thus in effect preserving, at least for one reign, a kind of historical record. But by 1570, any survivors among those charged with reciting cantares of the deeds of Wanaka, whose reign may have started some 80 years before that date, could hardly have provided a great deal of information that went unrecorded by earlier chroniclers. The question logically then arises, if some kind of documentary data was available in Peru, corresponding to the hypothetical Chronica X, then how and why did this prime source ever come into existence? The Declaración de los Quipucamayos records how the viceroy, Baca de Castro, who governed from 1541 to 1544, summoned all the older Incas of Cusco in order to find out about their past history, decades before Viceroy Toledo's famous conference on the same subject. The elders first produced quite different accounts of what happened, but then requested more time to consult together in order to produce a more coherent version. Juan de Betanzos and Francisco de Villacastin served as interpreters for this coordinated account. At this moment, barely a decade after the conquest, these older Incas of Cusco could have been well placed to supply vivid recollections of Huanacapax's campaigns, apart from any information officially memorized in cantares. For instance, at the time of the Viceroy's inquiries, the puppet Inca ruler, Paulo Inca, a legitimate son of Wanaka, was still alive. He died in 1549. It is surely not illogical to suggest that once a coordinated version of history based on statements made by older Incas barely 10 years after the conquest had been produced, it might then have been recorded in writing. But if this indeed occurred, and any Chronicle X-type document came into existence, it would be also reasonable to assume that the text would have been drafted by one or more Spaniards, with the Indians serving as Quechua-speaking informants. At that comparatively early date, few, if any, leading Orejones would have been literate. Paulo, for instance, wore Spanish clothes and learned to copy his name but could not read or write Spanish. Betanzos was, of course, most proficient in Quechua, but now that his complete manuscript has been made available, it becomes evident that, particularly for Tupac and Wanaka, he tends to focus more upon other aspects of the Inca rulers' brains than upon the prowess of conquest, concerning which he supplies relatively few names. Accordingly, although his participation in the compilation of some more specific record of campaigns and battles should not necessarily be ruled out, Francisco de Villacastin and other Spaniards then in Cusco are perhaps more likely responsible for any record of the Viceroy's conference and subsequent inquiries. In view of the copious information offered by Sarmiento and Cabello, not only on Juan Capax's campaigns but also on those of Tupac and even Pachacutec, it might be assumed that the editors of any earlier record placed some reliance on oral traditions, much more alive in 1540 than in 1570, and personal recollections. Although certain aspects of accounts of Tupac's achievements tend to bear such an uncanny resemblance to those of his successor, a rich store of oral tradition recalling the deeds and legends associated with the name of the great Pachacutec surely survived for a limited period after the conquest. Paradoxically, in a few specific aspects, Sarmiento's information is more detailed for Pachacutec's reign than for those of his successors. For instance, only for this reign are the names not only of Inca captains, but also of enemy leaders regularly reported. The final version. In 1572, nearly 30 years after the Viceroy Vaca de Castro's conference, Viceroy Francisco Toledo summoned the known descendants of Wanaka to inquire about Inca history. Few of these individuals can have been closely connected with events occurring so long ago. Of two names as being as many as 90 years old, one was the son of a local curaca appointed by Tupac, and the other's father had been a servant of Wanaka. The information recorded by Toledo himself, derived from this Cusco meeting and other gatherings that took place in provincial centers, is somewhat restricted. However, the Viceroy took another step to satisfy his curiosity when he commissioned Sarmiento de Gamboa to probe further into the past. Sarmiento was charged in particular with determining who were the true or rightful owners of the lands dominated by the Incas at the time of the Spanish invasion. Sarmiento was a very important official who had presided over the Royal Council of the Indies prior to Toledo's arrival. His work was certainly the result of the most careful research, supplemented by advice from other learned Spaniards such as Polo de Ondegardo, who had played a leading role in coordinating Toledo's inquiries on the Inca past and held personal consultations with the leading survivors among the Orejones of Cusco. After presenting Sarmiento's work to other Indians, who meekly assented that it was correct, Toledo sent the manuscript finely bound to King Philip II. This copy eventually reached the library of the University of Göttingen in 1785, but was not published until 1906. On the very tentative assumption that some documentary evidence was indeed recorded before the 1570s but later lost, it would seem more plausible to suggest that such detailed information might have been conveyed verbally rather than in writing to Sarmiento, and perhaps later to Cabello, by the Inca princes called by Toledo. More credit was surely to be gained by passing on the information in piecemeal form, as if it were the product of their own ingenuity and knowledge, than by simply handing over any existing written text or texts. Such a method would also help to explain the differences, both in spelling and in content, between the works of Sarmiento and Cabello. The younger and hence more literate Inca princes had been carefully schooled by learned Spanish such as Juan de Cuellar, who taught Latin and grammar to the mestizos, sons of noble enrichment. Such princes also could have briefed a few of their non-literate elders on selected items revealed in any document so that they could also play their part and, as if from memory, pass on such information to the Spanish chroniclers. Cabello, though admitting some of Sarmiento's data, particularly on the reign of Pachacutec, describes in more dramatic detail the major incidents in the Ecuadorian wars of Wanaka, such as the massacre at Yahuacocha and the long and important digression on Lambayeque, no doubt obtained when he was there in 1581. He could have obtained much additional data not recorded by Sarmiento during his period of residence in Quito, where a number of descendants of Inca leaders also resided. In particular, he consulted Auki Francisco Tupac, another son of Atahuallpa. From him and from other informants, Cabello was doubtless able to glean stories of former wars in which their fathers or grandfathers had fought, together with certain traditions that had survived among those tribes who had fought against the Incas. Cabello was a close friend of Cristobal de Molina, whose own Lives of the Emperors was lost. The latter also knew Sarmiento and had cooperated with Toledo in his inquiries. The cost of conquest. The foregoing suggestions constitute only a tentative attempt to seek plausible origins for much of our available data on Inca history. It is surely fair to imply that, without accepting the existence of some kind of documentary bridge between histories of the 1570s and 1580s and events occurring so long before, it becomes harder to concede an adequate degree of credibility to these sources. Obviously, we cannot claim to possess anything approaching a full account of what occurred throughout the empire. Nonetheless, though most, if not all, the recorded data need to be treated with some reservations, it is hardly realistic to go to the opposite extreme and to suggest that accounts of major events, such as the Yahuacocha massacre, the scene of which was visited by Ciesa so soon after the event, were simply invented. In particular, for the reign of Wanaka, many disasters as well as victories are recorded. It is surely far-fetched to suggest that, however our chroniclers obtained their information, the proud warriors who briefed the Spaniards fabricated so many stories of defeats as well as victories in their past. In the final analysis, however abundant the material provided by Cabello and others on the Ecuadorian wars, and however scanty their data on many other campaigns, one is left wondering just why the Incas pressed on into such far distant lands at both extremities of their empire, creating an elongated domain of increasingly unmanageable proportions. While Valdemar Espinosa suggests that the pacification of the northern extremity of Tawantinsuyu had literally exhausted the material reserves accumulated by the Incas in that region. All accounts, moreover, refer to the huge losses in manpower incurred in these campaigns, and if the cost was so great, were the rewards in any way commensurate? Few luxury articles were native to Quito and northern Ecuador. Admittedly, pearls and jewels came from the north Ecuadorian coast of Esmeraldas, and so perhaps did the highly prized spondylus shells, but this region was never really subdued. Quito occupied a strategic position in the flow of commodities and was more important in this respect than as a population center. Moreover, not only the physical but also the political cost of the Ecuadorian expansion was surely immeasurable. As P suggests, Huascar, in incorporating the Quito region, imperiled the whole imperial system. Conquest of lands beyond a certain distance from Cusco made control even harder. The establishment of Tumebamba as a symbolic replica of Cusco, involving the absence of the Inca from the capital, encroached upon Cusco's unique ascendancy. The problem was not exclusively political. The Inca, as son of the sun, bore his divine character wherever he went, and his presence conferred upon Tumebamba an added aura of sanctity, but at the expense of the original capital. The absorption of Ecuador, which perhaps held forth fewer material rewards than Chile and reportedly offered even fiercer resistance, surely increased the danger of a cleavage in the imperial structure. Equally, the objectives of the various campaigns in Antisuyu and the large territories occupied by Chunchos, Chirihuanos, and others are far from clear. Tropical products from the Amazonic jungle were presumably to some extent obtainable without military conquest. The Incas were apparently known to peoples living far beyond the limits of their empire, who might have been suppliers of such products. And if the reports of these campaigns are to be believed, their forces suffered reverses on such a scale that the cost of the operations might have outweighed any material gain. The Spaniards also fought wars against some of these tribes, but thereafter chose to abandon territory previously gained by the Incas. The case of the southern border is somewhat different. Here, too, immense distances from the capital were involved, but at least more tangible rewards may have been present in the form of minerals such as gold, for which Inca appetite was insatiable. One wonders, however, whether even such rewards really justified the effort involved in obtaining them, a point to which we shall return in the concluding chapter. This concludes Chapter 4.